Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to span the range of the first 22 verses of Matthew's 23rd chapter. The 23rd chapter is 39 verses. We're going to read the first 6 paragraphs today and save the final 7 for another lesson. The midway point is the midway point, incidentally, of the 6th paragraph we'll be touching on. But before we do that, we just want to briefly review what occurs in the antecedent chapter, the 22nd, which begins with the parable of a king whose son is about to be married, and he sends out his servants to summon the guest, and some of them kill the servant, so the king razes the city to the ground. He says, all right, these people aren't worthy to attend my son's wedding, so he sends his servants. The wedding feast indeed is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Therefore go into the street corners, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding ceremony. So as many as you find, that there's no limitation on that. He's telling him to go to the street corners, invite everyone in, but one of these guests, it turns out, doesn't come prepared with his wedding clothes, and he is sent to hell. So the wedding is the Messiah who is wedded to his church, and we have to be clothed in his righteousness in order to be received and welcomed by him. But the line which closes the story is, many are called, but few are chosen. So the call is universal. It comes to us all in one size, shape, or another, but few are chosen. Few embrace and respond to the call accordingly. But a lot of us weren't qualified when we were called, but we've become qualified now that we are called. So to reduce it to a cliche and a slogan, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Then we read of a series of theological controversies, mostly between himself and the Pharisees. They are initially allied with the Herodians, so this is an unlikely alliance because the Pharisees were patriots who took point in pride in resisting and defying Roman authority, where Herod, the reigning monarch, owed his throne to the Roman powers. So these were pro-Romans versus, pro-patriots. But they had combined, and they deceive him with all sorts of flattery. They say you only speak true. Then the question they present to them is, it is right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? So the Herodians would have been taxpayers, willing ones and friendly ones, and the Pharisees would have been reluctant or begrudging ones. But he knew their wickedness. He had subterranean spiritual insight into their motives and intents, and he asked them, "Why do you tempt me, you hypocrites?" And then he said to him, he asked for the coin. He asked whose inscription is on it, and they say to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, then render unto Caesar's that which is Caesar's, and unto Elohim what is Elohim's. So there is mutual allegiances that the Christian owes. They owe to their country and their government, which protects them, and also the king, the sovereign king, the one who rules on the sky, the one whose earth, the occupants of power, owe their positions of power by his grace alone. And he successfully silenced them. But later that same day, the Sadducees, these were a different theological factions, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees were two otherwise mutually antagonistic. Both were born in the exile period. The Pharisees were the separatists. These were the ones who resisted the encroachment of the Hellenization of culture, but the Sadducees were more aristocratic. They were appeasers and collaborators, and there were also theological disputes, one of which the Pharisees upheld and affirmed the doctrine of the resurrection, whereas the Sadducees denied it. And they come to him asking a question. They say that this woman was married to 7 brothers in a row, each of whom died before the first. Whose wife shall she be in the resurrection? And Yahshua answering said to them, You go astray, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of Elohim. For in the resurrection they do not marry, nor are they given in marriage, but are as angels of Elohim in the heavens. And concerning the resurrection of the dead, you have not Have you not read what was spoken to you by Elohim, saying, I am the Elohim of Abraham, and the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob? Yahweh is not the Elohim of the dead, but of the living. So one of the things I could have mentioned or should have mentioned in my comparison and contrast between the Pharisees and the Sadducees is that the Sadducees alone affirm the writings of Moses as canonical. The doctrine of the resurrection is somewhat hazy. The word never is mentioned in the Old Testament, but the concept does emerge. But its earliest original form, he charges them of failure to heed the scriptures they have heard. They would have recognized this passage as Exodus 6:3, and because he is the Elohim of the patriarchs who came some 400 years before Moses, and because that is implicit declaration that they are still alive and they are still in their presence. So he is the Elohim of the dead and not the living, but of the living, sorry. Then this Pharisees come back once more and they ask him, what is the greatest command? This question, there was no subject of controversy that was too discreet or too minute to escape the scholarly community's argumentative activities. And one of the greatest one was, which is the greatest laws? There were 613 in the laws of Moses, but the question was, which one was greater than there? And they ask him, and Yahshua says to him, you shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great command. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commands hang all the law and the prophets. So this is recognizable as originating from Deuteronomy 6:5. Mark's version records 6:4. But this is the first commandment, to love Yahweh. And if you love Yahweh, the more you gravitate to the source of the love, the better able you will be enabled to love your fellow man on earth. So as we approach the nucleus, the greater our capacity to love our fellow man as created creatures, and this is the summation and the meaning of all the laws and all the prophets. So these two concepts once more originate from Moses, the writings of Moses, the first Deuteronomy, the second Leviticus 19:18. And then there's just a final question from the Pharisees once more. Who is the Messiah? Whose son is he? And they told him he was of David. And then he said to them, then how does David in the Spirit call him Master, saying, Yahweh said to Master, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for their feet. So this is a citation of Psalm 2:7. If David calls him Master, how is he his son? So he just flipped that whole upside down, basically communicating that the Messiah was going to be a descendant of David, but a literal son in direct manifestation of Yahweh the Father. He would be him in incarnate form, and no one was able to answer him a word, and from that day on, no one asked him any more questions. So you would think he settled the war, but they're in fact conspiring to kill him, and they're bringing about this chapter takes place, the chapter we'll be covering and the chapter which precedes it, takes place in the final week of the Savior's lifetime. So we're going to get started with the opening verse of the 23rd chapter. Then Yahshua spoke to the crowds and to his disciples. So this is a different audience. He is teaching. He is not arguing between antagonists or answering questions with deceptive intent. He is speaking to the crowds and to those who had gathered and those who were his disciples. So the crowds would have been maybe just kind of curious to see what he has to say. The disciples would have been those who had given their lives and committed themselves to the calling, to connect it to 22:14. Saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses. So this was an established fact. They were the recognized religious authorities and the upholders and preservers and maintainers and upkeepers of the law of Moses. They were the recognized authority at the synagogue level, at least. The Sadducees generally reigned supreme at the temple level. But throughout Judea, throughout Jewry, the Pharisees would have been the recognized rulers on matters pertaining to the laws of Moses and the Judaic religion itself. Therefore, whatever he says to you to keep and do, but do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. So he's highlighting a clear discrepancy between their walk and their talk. They are not practicing what they preaching. They know how to say the right things, and they are skilled and adept and scholarly in laws pertaining to the Mosaic law, but they subtly, through these conniving manipulations, circumvent the principles and the duties as described there. We're going to read of some of that later. So he's telling them to listen to them, but don't watch them, don't follow them by watching them. You know, everything they have to say is valid. They say the right things, but they do not do the right things. And what do we read in James? Blessed is the doer, not the hearer of the word. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but with their finger they do not want to move them. So they add to the struggle, but they don't alleviate their proselytes and disciples' burdens. They impose additional legalistic injunctions that are not authorized in the law of Moses, not inspired by the Spirit, not commanded by Yahweh. These are laws of their own making. So they were obsessed and legalistically obsessed with the their own oral traditions that they carried and maintained, and this made only a heavier burden, and one, it misdirected the disciples' mind in the wrong direction, but they wouldn't lift. And one of the examples we witness of this is in the Good Samaritan parable of not lifting one finger when a priest and a Levite walk by this man beaten senseless by robbers and strangers on the road. They walk to the other side. The priest goes right away. The Levite kind of pauses and looks at him, but figures it's not worth his time because he would have had to maintain his ceremonial cleanliness, and to touch a dead or bloody body would have defiled them. So they were more concerned, and all the way up to the crucifixion, the Jews were concerned not to step foot in Pontius Pilate's courtyard because they would have been contaminated by the touch of the Gentile, but here they were sending over the promised Messiah of their own writings that they were supposed, allegedly affirmed, uphold, and maintained, and defended, and taught with authority. But when it came time, when it really mattered most, when it came to lift, help, so that's what we want to think of as our leaders, those who can help us, not those who add to our burdens. And they do all their works to be seen by men, and they make their phylacteries wide and lengthen the garbs of their garments. So when publicity is the motive of doing good deeds, you render what should be a selfless act. It is tainted by selfishness because your chief concern is the recognition for doing what you do rather than the recipient of your graces. So, they prayed in public, they fasted, exaggerated their emaciated state just to let everyone know they were fasting. They gave alms by tossing coins that were purposely weighty and just so they made a clank in the temple bell. So they were motivated by publicity, but in private they were less than circumspect. And the phylacteries were means through which an Orthodox obedient Jew was to have the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4. Remember, we read that in Matthew's 22nd chapter, verse 37, written on their forehead. And by the time of the Pharisees, they had elongated ones that just, it was just to draw attention and publicity to the one who wore them rather than to remind what is written on them. And they love the best places at the feast and the best seats in the synagogues. So the master instructed his disciples to resist the currents of the Pharisees elsewhere. He says, the first shall be, don't worry about this, your seat at the table. That is what the sinners and the hypocrites and the Gentiles do. So the Pharisees were very much like the Gentiles in this manner, and they were allegedly the pure separatist Jews. That's what the term means. It translates as separatist. So when Judaism was succumbing to the pressures of Hellenistic cultural conquest, this sect among them took upon themselves to be separate from that and to preserve and maintain the purity of the Jewish religion. So it began with a noble idea, but what happened is they started adding on to the laws, and they started just making these extra laws so everyone could say, look at me, I'm so pious, I'm so righteous, and then it just became sort of a worship of the Pharisees, and that's when the Messiah comes along, and he reigns on their parade like no one else can. He taught with the authority, unlike them, unlike the scribes and Pharisees. And the greetings in the marketplace, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. So the term rabbi is actually not Hebrew or even, but it is Aramaic in origin. So this term would have came into being when the synagogue came, was during the exile and after the exile. So by that time, rabbis would have been local synagogue authorities and teachers, and it would have been a title of honor and respect, and Yahshua was called a rabbi on more than one occasion, and I think that was Mary Magdalene's response when she encountered him in resurrected form. But you do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, Messiah, and you are all brothers. So he's telling, he's dismantled. One, he came to proclaim a new religion that was away from the Judaism as it came to be known, and there are no rabbis in Christendom, but also there is to be an equality of believers. So even though we don't have rabbis, the Catholic Church at least has fathers, and that's the next to the one that he commands them to sort of stay away from calling people. But you are all brothers, that means you are all equals, so let no man who is equal to another stand superior to his equal. And call none on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in the heavens. So this, the Father would have been a reference to a reverend or an ecclesiastical authority, but there is the one Father. This is distinct from an earthly father. This is a spiritual Father, and that Father is in heaven, and no man on earth can substitute for the Father, capital F. And the Catholic Church has conveniently overlook this passage, shall we say, at minimum. They call every reverend and friar father, in direct contradiction of the principle of this passage. Verse 10, neither be called leaders, for one is your leader, the Messiah. So he's not abolishing leadership positions in the assembly he came to start, which continues the work that he began on earth, but he's saying let no one be called leaders. He's not saying that people should not lead, but let no one be called leaders, because that distracts. And any pastor who treats their assembly or their congregation or their flock or their church or anything else as their own personal possession, stay away from such a one, because it is not theirs, it is Yahshua's. We are just caretakers and stewards, but some of us do lead, but we shouldn't call ourselves the leaders. We are not the heads of our churches. We are just the surrogates, really. Where were we? But the greatest among you shall be your servant. So he's reversing and flipping around, complete 180, the worldly operation of greatness, as the world measures greatness, especially in the ancient world, it would have been by the number of servants that one had at their command and at their disposal. But he's saying that leadership, the great leadership, the true leadership that must make the church flourish and function, is servitude. So our leaders lead the way in making themselves servants to all and any, So that is the paradox of Christian ministry. We are to be servant leaders. And whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. Once more, this is a reversal, a 180, a complete flip around of the world's understanding. The world is constantly, everyone in it is trying to exalt themselves. We all crave fame, adulation, acclaim, popularity, just whatever. But if you spend all your time building your name up and you're only exalting yourself and not others around you or the company or team you work for, if you're not a team player, you're just all about yourself, exalting himself, there you're going to be humbled and you're going to be humiliated. And the difference is this: humility and humiliated both stem from the same Latin etymological root, the word humus, which means to the ground. So an a truly humble person will be internally oriented, to be down to the ground, whereas the exalted will have to be humiliated from their exalted station. They rise themselves up, they puff them up, then someone has to bring them down. It's got to be an external actor or agent, because they have no internal mechanism. But it's going to be unavoidable. Even if you make it through your whole life without having your ego deflated, eventually and inevitably it will be. But if you humble yourself, you shall be exalted, so you shall reap the opposite reward of that which you cultivated on earth. And here's the first three of the woes to the scribes and the Pharisees, and we're actually going to break it at the 15th verse because we think we have enough time to cover all the rest. Remember the paragraph, so we're just covering the first 5 paragraphs of this chapter. We're saving the 7 or 8, whatever it is, for another time. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut up the kingdom of the heavens before men. You do not go in, nor do you allow those entering to go in. So their sacred charge, their reason for existence, their whole entire function was to point and lead men and women to the kingdom of heaven, but they had shut the gates through their own additional burdens and from their own erroneous emphases to spiritual disciplines. And they should have had the keys, but they were only locking the gate to everyone who was in their sway. And why were these words so harsh for leaders? Because leaders who are hypocrites are unfit to lead. That is a fleecer of the flock and not a servant or a shepherd thereof. And this we witness especially in the next passage. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you eat of widows' houses, and for a show make long prayers. Because of this you shall receive greater judgment. So remember, they were motivated by publicity to do their good works, as we earlier read. And for show, they made great prayer to conceal the fact that they were ripping off widows. Widows were especially Yahweh's concern for the widows, the vulnerable, and the outcasts is reflected in the law of Moses. But they were fleecing them dry. They didn't live large, but they certainly coveted money. They were puritanical, so they weren't spenders, but they were accumulators and covetous of money and gold and everything else. And so a lot of them would have taken, straight advantage of a widow. They would have robbed them, and they would have been on the street praying to conceal from the public the blackness of their own heart. And receiving the greater judgment, this is the consequence of we who teach. We have to receive the greater judgment. It is a responsibility that is a burden and a blessing. So if you lead others into the correct path, the true path, the straight and narrow path to salvation, you will be blessed manifold. But if you lead others to the dark way, if you deviate any way or off course of the straight and narrow, then you are receiving the judgment that you had led others astray to. Final verse of today's lesson. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you go about the land and sea to win one convert, and when he is won, you make him a son of Gehenna, twofold more than yourself. So Gehenna would have been the Greek term for Hades or hell, and so that would have been Sheol in the Hebrew language. But the point of the passage is that these Pharisees were bringing damage, excessive, inordinate amounts of damage on those they had proselytized. So a proselyte would have been fully circumcised. There were such thing as what were known as God-fearing Gentiles. These were the ones who went to synagogue and worshipped and maintained a monotheism without being fully circumcised or baptized. So a proselyte would have been a baptized, circumcised, and baptism was only necessary for non-birth Jews. It was for pagan converts to their religion. So they being Pharisees, they would have insisted upon the circumcision, and that this element was certainly alive and well in the Judaizers, who were a Pharisaical philosophy and ideology that had infiltrated early Christianity in places such as Galatia. Paul's writings attest to this. But, for all their efforts and for all their energies, all they were doing was leading someone straight to Lucifer and straight to hell. And that's the exact opposite of the path we want to go. And we know that we're giving you the right resources and equipment to make the correct decisions and maintain the walk in the straight and narrow, because that's what it's all about, the straight and narrow, which leads to eternal life. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Take care until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.